imagination of the world. He was dedicated to the gospel of flight, and it was all really to publicize flight. After all, if you become a god, you want your parishioners to keep on with the incense, if nothing else.
Lindbergh's flight fired an explosion of interest in commercial aviation.
Prime.
Center engine primed.
Ready to start. Center engine.
Clear center engine.
The Ford Trimotor, America's first purpose-built airliner, was ready to exploit the public interest.
It was built as a very sturdy plane, and it's still flying, some of them. It shows how very overstrong it had been built because they didn't know what to expect. The Ford Motor Company had been interested in aviation by Bill Stout, who had built a single-engine plane, but Mr. Ford felt he wanted more safety, and so we developed the Ford Trimotor plane.
So strongly built was the Trimotor, it could even loop the loop. Henry Ford set up a small production line in part of his giant Detroit car factory to build Trimotors.
We had 2 or 3 aeronautical engineers that came to the Ford Motor Company and supervised the construction of it. It was much more of a hand-built affair. And there weren't so very many of them built, you know, altogether.
Soon specialist factories were springing up with names like Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed to supply the newly emerging airlines. And the first links between operators and manufacturers were forged.
I think it was one of the very first all-metal planes with an enclosed cabin for the pilots, a wheel on at the rear in place of a tail skid, and brakes so that it could operate more like an automobile in that sense. The corrugations were built so they ran in the direction of the wind. And this, we had quite an argument in Europe over this question, because the Europeans claimed they had a patent on corrugations that ran in the same direction as the wind, which seemed too silly for words. Well, it was nothing like a modern plane. It was heavy. Sometimes you needed help from the co-pilot to handle it in rough weather. It had an excellent wing profile that gave it a good lift.
In 1928, to fly to the West Coast, passengers from New York first had to take the train to Columbus, Ohio. There, they boarded the Trimotor of TAT Airlines, which took them by stages to Los Angeles, including an overnight stop. One of the airline's executives was Eugene Vidal. His son, Gore Vidal, the writer, was the first child to fly across America.
When you look back on it, I mean, they were sublimely uncomfortable, not as uncomfortable as air travel now, naturally. First of all, you always had a container beside your seat, which you were to vomit. And the passengers would just go like that and then go on talking. The planes are going like that. And then, and I've never seen a description of this overwhelming smell of burning petrol. I mean, you really were almost asphyxiated at times because they hadn't worked out how to air condition these things. My father decided to serve lunch. It was the first time a meal had ever been served on an airplane. And my mother, who was very grand and always on a diet, said, oh, everybody loves consomme. Well, the first group from Washington, New York, who had the consomme were scalded to death. In those days, we were not so litigious, so there were no lawsuits. And after that, my father decreed hard-boiled eggs, the only thing they would serve, and coffee, but at your peril, it was always tepid.
For For all the discomfort these early passengers experienced, they had the first memorable opportunity to see from the air the grandeur of the American continent. Their journey ended at Burbank Airport in Los Angeles.
We went down so fast that both of my eardrums were cracked. And so, screaming up a storm, I'm taken off the plane with blood trickling down my tiny lobes. My father, the manager of the airline, yes, you loved that flight, didn't you, my boy? First child to have flown across the country is shrieking up a storm. I'm just going like this at him, and the blood streaming down the ears. That is my memory of the first year of transcontinental flight.
Some early entrepreneurs realized that the new airliners offered other business opportunities.
I formed a company called Scenic Airways and bought 2 of the Ford Trimotors and flew them out to the Grand Canyon for a sightseeing service, which is still the oldest sightseeing service in operation. The first time I flew over the canyon, it's almost indescribable, but it's almost a religious feeling you get as you pass over the rim, and then the ground suddenly opens up below you and you see this wonderful expanse of colored rock with the tiny river down at its base.
When Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, there was no organized air passenger service in the United States. Within a year, 60,000 people were being carried by the new airlines. 2 years later, the figure had reached 250,000. Lindbergh had rung in the dawn of a new age of commercial aviation. In many ways, the Europeans had been more far-sighted. Germany, prevented after the war from having an air force, poured its resources into a state airline, Lufthansa. It had regular flights all over Europe, carrying tens of thousands of passengers, long before Lindbergh woke up America to air transport. An airmail service to the outposts of empire was what Britain wanted. And the airline charged with the task of carrying it was the government-backed Imperial Airways. It took passengers too, though not as many as Lufthansa. Luxury was what Imperial offered. And by the 1930s, it had the aircraft to provide it. The Handley Page 42.
Nothing will ever come up to that feeling as I stepped aboard that aircraft for the first time, to see this great lumbering giant as it looked then, a cockpit that looked like a greenhouse stuck on the front, all perspex. It was known as the Flying Orange Box, of course, because of the tail formation. The only people that could afford to fly were government officials whose fare was paid, and of course the very wealthy, whose privilege was to fly around the world wherever they chose to go. And it was our job to make that flight as pleasant and as comfortable and as easygoing as possible. Whatever their want, we were expected to supply it.
The HP-42 had to land very frequently to refuel because headwinds cut our ground speed to 30 or 40 miles per hour. It sounds quite remarkable, but we frequently dropped down to those speeds, crossing the desert. We stopped, for example, at Sharjah, which was a fascinating place. To land there on a patch of sand and taxi up to this very solid fort was quite an experience.
Abbas Khan. 6 Saabs coming tonight.
Sorry.
I'll come and inspect the rooms in half an hour.
Sorry.
Airplane coming 5:30.
Both अच्छा sir.
Net! Surface wind and barometric pressure, please.
Right. Surface wind northwest 8 miles. Barometric pressure 10 40.2.
Wind northwest.
You were transformed into a completely new world, where you were taking weeks to do something you did in a matter of hours. One moment you were in the cold of the UK, and within a very short time, you were transformed to the Middle East or the Far East. You were a butler, you were a diplomat, you were a confidant, you were everything to those passengers. It was a love affair. It was something that you wouldn't go into if you weren't absolutely dedicated to it.
Warborough was in the club the night before I left. He asked to be remembered to you all. He's in fine fettle, whacking the old ball.
You felt it was something that was going into the next century and you wanted to be part of it.
In America, the priority of the independent airlines was the growing domestic market. But before long, a new company, Pan American Airways System, saw the attractions of an international airmail and passenger service. The airline was the creation of a far-seeing, if ruthless man, named Juan Trippe.
The way in which this force, air transportation, is used will have a tremendous bearing on the future of mankind.
Trippe's first goal was a network of routes from the United States to the Caribbean and Central America. He soon realized that the seaplane was the ideal aircraft for his plans. Few of the countries on his intended routes had airfields, but a seaplane could land in harbors, rivers, and lakes, thus opening up most major cities in South America to his operations. Trippe, however, had even wider ambitions for his tiny airline.
When he offered me the job, I told him, I said, Juan, you don't have enough work for me to do. You only have 2 airplanes. And he said, oh, he said, but we're going to have a fleet of airplanes. He said, we're going down to South America. He said, we're going over to Europe, and we're going to cross the Pacific. I said, it's amazing. He said, well, we're going to do it.
Trippe set about establishing a network of routes with ruthless efficiency. He started by winning the first 2 airmail contracts to Panama and the Windward Islands. By cultivating foreign governments, he then shut out his rivals and established an effective monopoly on the routes. This pattern was repeated wherever he opened a service. He was accused of corruption with foreign officials and collusion with the U.S. Post Office. But soon Pan Am was booming. Indeed, in some people's eyes, was almost an extension of U.S. foreign policy.
Juan Trippe wanted to be the czar of air transportation. He wanted to have the U.S. premier airline. He didn't want competition at all. He wanted to be the international representative of the country. A ruthless man, of course, as I guess sometimes you have to be. But I had great admiration for his ability and for the wonderful dreams he had and his ability to bring them into operation.
This latest clipper will be christened the Brazilian Clipper by Madame Vargas, wife of the President of Brazil, and will be placed in service on the East Coast trade route between the United States, Brazil, and the Argentine.
Trippe took every opportunity to keep Pan Am in the public eye. He hired Charles Lindbergh to survey and open up new routes, exploiting Lindbergh's skill as a pilot and his fame. And nothing guaranteed press or public attention more than the prospect of Lindbergh inaugurating a new service. Pan Am's fleet of aircraft grew, and so did Trippe's ambitions. He saw the lucrative potential of routes across the Atlantic and the Pacific. With the giant seaplane, the S-42, Trippe first planned an Atlantic service. But when the British, who had no aircraft that could carry passengers across the Atlantic, refused him landing rights, he turned instead to the Pacific. Pan Am began the immense task of building a chain of airports on remote islands and atolls across the great ocean. Lagoons had to be dynamited to clear coral reefs, hotels and workshops built, fuel dumps constructed. The first stage, from Alameda in California to Hawaii, was the longest, 2,400 miles. In April 1935, test pilot Captain Eddie Music made the first proving flight. It took almost 18 hours. The trip back took 2 hours longer.
They just barely made it back. There were only 72 gallons of gas left in the tanks. Captain Music was supposed to do his triumphant circle over the city, and he said, hell with that. He came and landed straight in.
In 1937, the British finally had a seaplane they felt capable of crossing the Atlantic, the C-class Empire flying boat. So they struck a two-way deal with Pan Am. On July the 5th, a Pan Am S-42 flying boat left LaGuardia, New York, to fly to Southampton. At exactly the same time, a C-class Empire flying boat of Imperial Airways took off from Southampton Water, bound for New York. Both survey flights were a success, but to achieve it, the British had stripped out all interior fittings to give their plane enough range. And their Pan Am rival had installed extra fuel tanks inside the cabin. Both were operating at the limits of technology. No airline yet had an aircraft capable of carrying passengers across the Great Divide. It would be another 2 years before an aircraft would come into operation that could comfortably cross the Atlantic. Pan Am's Boeing Clipper could carry 72 passengers and plenty of freight. But 3 months after it came into service, Britain was at war. By the time the conflict ended and the Atlantic was once more open to commercial operations, the days of the great flying boats were over. By then, too, the age of individual trailblazers had passed. But they had left a rich legacy of achievements for post-war aviation to build on.
What limitless possibilities aviation holds when planes can fly non-stop between New York and Paris. The year will surely come when passengers and mail fly every day from America to Europe. Planes may even replace automobiles someday, just as automobiles replaced horses. Possibly everyone will travel by air in another 50 years. I'm not sure I like the idea of millions of planes flying around overhead, but I love the sky's unbroken solitude. What is aviation leading to? What effect will it have on the lives of men? That it will bring revolutionary changes seems certain.
The dream has been to build bigger and bigger aircraft. This is the latest, the C-5 Galaxy, big enough to carry 2 helicopters, 6 buses, or 100 cars. Its cargo hold is longer than the length of the Wright brothers' first flight. It's truly a giant of the air. Throughout aviation's lifetime, aircraft have been used as beasts of burden. The military especially have always needed a flying truck. Today, this is the workhorse of the skies. The C-130, the ubiquitous Hercules, flown by almost every air force in the Western world.
It'll do anything you ask it to do. It's a forgiving aeroplane. From a pilot's point of view, it handles remarkably well. You have an empathy with the machine. I've flown it now for nearly 5,000 hours, and I can't think of anything else that I'd prefer to fly. It's nicknamed the Fat Albert, certainly in the RAF, and I think all over the world. The Hercules and its type of aircraft allow an air force to move men and machinery relatively quickly to anywhere in the world, which gives the Air Force and the Army commanders a flexibility which not many airplanes can offer them.
In war, the C-130 has proved itself a tough and reliable friend. In 1968 in Vietnam, nearly 100 C-130s flew in supplies to a force of U.S. Marines, cut off and besieged in Khe Sanh by the North Vietnamese Army. For 77 days, the Hercules was Khe Sanh's lifeline. In peace, too, the C-130 has shown its mettle. In the Ethiopian famine, thousands of families were dying of starvation. They needed food desperately, and they needed it at once.
Initially, our mission in Ethiopia was to move grain from the port of Assab to the two airstrips at Mekelle and Axum. We later expanded that to use the aircraft to its most capable, which was in the air drop roll, and to reach the people that possibly needed the food more than anybody else who was stuck way out in the highlands. The terrain is quite unbelievable. You're talking about the Grand Canyon on a fantastic scale. Highlands up to 10,000 feet that simply can't be reached by any other form of transport, certainly not in the time that we could do it. We could do a 3/4-hour flight with 20 tons of grain on board, but the same journey would take a lorry 2 weeks. I had briefed the mission. I knew what was expected and what we had to do. It seemed quite straightforward. 15 feet above the ground, 4 tons of grain, push it out of the back and go around again and do it again. And then you arrive at Ajibar West, 10,000 feet above sea level. Very mountainous indeed. There's a 200-foot ravine just before the drop zone, which means getting 15 feet right as you go over the lip is going to be difficult. Tremendous feeling of exhilaration. Navigator calls the red on. The load's pushed to the rear of the aircraft, and then with green on, out it goes. My memory of Ethiopia, without a doubt, is the most satisfying and exhilarating time of my life. We went out there with an opportunity to do something. Within 5 days of arriving there, we knew that people were getting the food that we were delivering to them. You could see them eating it. And I don't think anybody could be failed to be moved by that. I certainly wasn't.
For 30 years, the workmanlike Hercules has proved just how useful a flying truck can be. In World War I, strategists had seen the need for large airplanes, to bomb, to transport, to carry freight. But engines in those days were just not powerful enough to lift the aircraft and a heavy cargo. A 500-pound bomb was the most this hand